All right, two other basic concepts that are key in understanding our sensation and perception. One is transduction, and another is thresholds, but we'll look at that in a minute. Transduction, by its nature, and the way to understand transduction is to understand how we process information. All of our senses basically perform three different steps. First of all, they receive sensory information. And, you know, when we talk about somebody being blind or deaf, that's one channel of sensory information that is blocked, whether that's because of organic reasons or any other reasons. So receiving sensory information. Secondly, and as I'm writing these, you may want to think ahead of me when we actually talk about it. So it receives it, then it has to do something with it in order for our system to use it. When we're talking to a computer, we don't speak in binary to it. It has to have some way of translating what we communicate to it, whether through a keyboard, whether through a tablet, whether through even language. It has to be translated into the binary language of computers called binary code or binary. So there has to be some kind of transformation that occurs that puts it in a form that can be understood by the system. So it has to transform info into neural impulses. So there has to be a transforming process for it to work the way it's supposed to work. And sometimes our errors come as a result of this particular process. The last one, the third one, is essentially delivering that neural information to the appropriate places in the brain. So from the bottom-up process, the receiving and transformation occurs at the senses. The nervous system is part of the delivery system to the brain itself. When you think about it, the brain is silent and isolated in the cranium. The only way that it can interact with the world around it is through the senses and the transformation they do accordingly. This whole process of converting one form of information or one form of energy into another is something that we refer to as the topic heading that we're talking about, and that is transduction. That's the fancy term, that's the one that we use to turn the information, the stimulation, the things that come in, light, sound, etc., into a form of energy that can be used by the brain is called transduction. The study of this area is called psychophysics, which it makes sense in the sense that it is a crossover point between psychology and the physical world and the physics of the world. So the study of how we detect effects, how we detect information and stimulation, and how it affects our psychological experiences itself. The second big concept is the concept of threshold and thresholds. And the reality is that we perceive something in the world around us when it gets above a certain level that registers to us. So there are a few terms here that go along with this, and that's absolute threshold. And if you were defining absolute threshold, you would define it as the minimum stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus 1 out of 2 times, or 50% of the time. That's the absolute threshold. So it has to raise above a certain level of stimulation in order for us to detect it. And when we detect it 50% of the time, we refer to that as the absolute threshold. A diagram in your book here is a good example. Is right here is everything below here is not seen as far as we're concerned. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we don't have the apparatus necessary to detect it. And so this line, if you will, right here is referred to as the Lyman. And when we talk about subliminal, anything below this line is subliminal. That's why we get this term, subliminal stimuli. We don't see it when it's down here. When it rises to this level, it rises above what we refer to as the Lyman, and at that point we say, I see the light, I see the dimness, I hear it, etc. All of those are very much a part of the absolute threshold itself. Now, there are a couple different theories that try to talk about, or at least describe, this whole idea of thresholds. The first one is a signal detection theory, and essentially the signal detection theory predicts how and when we detect the presence of a fate stimulus, assuming that our absolute threshold varies with our experience, our expectation, our motivation, and the level of fatigue. So signal detection theory factors in a number of things that affect our absolute factors that affect absolute threshold, and fatigue, the expectation. If I expect to see something, I tend to see it sooner. I'll give you a really good example of this particular one. Is in the Olympics, they were talking about how they timed athletes, and the starting blocks in track and field, the platform from which the swimmers jump from, are all wired so that if they jump faster than 1/100th of a second, then it's determined that they were anticipating, all right, like signal detection theory would suggest, they're anticipating hearing the gun and they've done a false start. They've started sooner than we would expect. We expect reaction time to be somewhere longer than 1/100th of a second. Anything shorter than that means that an athlete has false started. So signal detection theory. What I just described for you is something that would be similar to something we call the priming effect. And essentially the priming effect reveals that one can process some information from stimuli too weak to recognize. In other words, I can't really see it, but I'm primed to see it, I'm primed to hear it, indicating that much of the information processing occurs automatically. So there's something that occurs that is out of my awareness, but yet I am still processing it, which means that when the stimulus or the stimulation occurs, I will respond more quickly. And a priming effect would be that example I gave you with the swimmers, is that there are things that they're detecting in their environment that prime them, that they've automatically heard, whether that's the sound of the starter gun or the person handling it or sounds in the pool. All of those are priming effects that make it so that they respond that much more quickly. And I already mentioned a little bit about the subliminal information that goes on here. The last thing I want to mention is something that we refer to as the difference threshold. And that's the last concept around the thresholds. And essentially, the difference threshold is the minimum difference between two stimuli that a person can detect 50% of the time. Now, what you'll notice is that we're talking about 50% of the time, so 1 out of 2 times. The difference threshold is something we used to call the J, I'll try to write this real clearly, is J and D. In other words, just noticeable difference. It has come to be called Weber's law. And essentially, it is not a steady state. It changes proportional to the size of the stimulus. So if I have a 100-pound weight, let's say a 50-pound weight in my hand, 100 is a little bit much, but I have a 50-pound weight in my hand, and somebody adds a pound, I may not notice that. But if somebody adds 5 pounds, I will notice that, and it's at that level we would call it the just noticeable difference. Now, drop it down. I have 10 pounds, and somebody adds an ounce, I probably won't notice it at all. But if somebody adds a pound to it, I will notice it. Okay, so it's proportional to the size of the actual stimulus that I'm engaged with, and that's what we refer to as just noticeable difference. It is what Weber actually found was that it's proportional, it is not absolute. In other words, it depends on the size of the stimulus I'm interacting with as to where the just noticeable difference will be.